If you would, let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this opportunity to study your word. We're thankful that we can come together as congregation and shepherd and the comfort of the building and all that we have to promote good Bible study and things like that. Father, as we look into your word, help us in our understanding, as always, to be able to see the things that are needful for us. We're thankful for your word and that it is something that we can trust, that we have Scripture that is unchanging, and we can look to it to see what we need to do to build our faith and to receive salvation. We're thankful, of course, for Christ who died on the cross for our sins. It's in his name we pray. Amen. So let's begin with chapter 27, verse 1 through 12. We'll read that. Chapter 27, verses 1 through 12. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. When we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmon. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because of the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives." Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means that they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. So there in verses 1 and 2, Paul was delivered to a centurion. So he's going to be transported to Rome, where he is going to stand before Caesar, which is where he made his appeal. So Paul was delivered to a centurion named Julius with other prisoners and placed on a ship for transport. So, and we also learned that Aristarchus was there with Paul, but also, of course, Luke was with him as well. So there's those two. And so in verse 3, when they landed at Sidon, Julius granted Paul extra liberties, allowing him to visit his friends and receive care. If you think about the Roman soldier, what's his greatest fear about a prisoner? Right. So his greatest fear is escape. So normally you wouldn't let any prisoner leave like that.
Just like the Philippian jailer, when the cells opened, he thought that they all escaped, so he was about to kill himself. But then Paul said, "Do not worry, we're all here."
Right. So that's a hard, fast rule. So it's strange that Julius would allow Paul to leave and go to his friends. Did a soldier go with him? Probably, yes. But still, anytime you're transporting a prisoner, that provides opportunity for escape if they're not all contained in one place. So anytime you have that kind of thing, it adds to the danger of them escaping. So with Paul being allowed to do that, it just shows Julius's attitude. Julius is the commander over, he's a centurion, so it's 100 soldiers that he's over. And so he is allowing, he trusted Paul. Anyway, there in verse 6, this is at Myra, Paul was placed on an Alexandrian grain ship bound for Italy. So if you think about the passage where from where they left, the straightest course would be straight across the Mediterranean. But back in that day, that long of a voyage and everything brought more dangers. Plus, the ships are going to go where they're needed when they're carrying supplies, so they're going from city to city, that sort of thing. So he was placed on a ship that was going to hug the coastline. So when they get to Myra, they changed ships. So thinking about Aristarchus, who's with them, I think, it's just my opinion, I think that if Aristarchus was heading towards Thessalonica, then I think it probably would have mentioned that, that's where Aristarchus left them, but there's no mention of him leaving. At Myra was the only place that he could have gotten off to change to another ship that's heading up towards Thessalonica. So we don't know because the text doesn't tell us. So anyway, they changed ships, and this is an Alexandrian ship, and that's Egypt. And the primary purpose is transporting grain, so that's what that ship was. So they switch ships, and that's what they do. So verse 8, it says, with much difficulty sailing, they arrived at Fair Havens, a bay near the city of Lycia. And it's there that Paul warned that they should winter at Fair Havens due to dangerous weather conditions typical in the fall time of year. And there in verse 9, time references in the Bible are always connected to events. So instead of saying in November or something like that, it says the fast. And so the readers would know what fast he's talking about. So it'd be the Day of Atonement, the readers of Paul's day. So it was the time, the fast that was that part of the year. So it'd be the Day of Atonement. And so it's just a time reference, meaning the fall of the year. And ships don't usually travel between early November to early February due to dangerous weather conditions, which are typical. So Julius, Paul was trying to persuade them, let's just stay right here in Fair Havens instead of trying to go further, because it's way past time, and we're already struggling a little bit to travel. So it was his advice to stay there. Now, Paul, he's a well-traveled person, and he knows the sea and knows the conditions and everything. He's very familiar with that. So his advice was to remain there, but Julius was persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship, and also the majority of those with him, to sail on to Phoenix, which had a more suitable harbor. So that's what they decided to do, and they left. Now, Phoenix, or Venice, was a harbor about 50 miles away. So they're just trying to go 50 miles. Now, 50 miles don't seem like that far, but in those days it was kind of far. But at the same time, it seemed, with depressing weather and everything, that maybe they could go ahead and they should be able to make it. So that's the decision that they came up with. So let's continue on. And this one's a little bit lengthy, but it's verses 13 through 38. It says, when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous head wind arose, called a Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive, and running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we should be saved was finally given up. But after a long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me, and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul, you must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Now, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down the Adriatic Sea about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little farther, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eating nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from your head, any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. So going up to verses 13 and 14, they put out to sea and they sailed close by Crete. But of course, not long after, they encountered a storm with high winds. So a Euroclydon, also called a Eurykilo, probably it's probably from two Greek words meaning wind and waves. So there's no storm, like we don't use that term. So similar storms in the western part of the Mediterranean Sea are called levanters, which are much like a hurricane. So we know hurricanes, so we can kind of understand. So unable, there in verses 15 and 16, unable to go against the wind, they turned the ship and let the wind drive the ship in a southward course. So it mentions there in verse 16 that they secured the skiff while passing the island of Clauda, since it blocked some of the wind. So a skiff is what? It's a dinghy, a lifeboat. So in those times, we kind of think of things larger than what they were, but if you've ever looked at an old sailing ship, it is shockingly small. So when you look at it, so you think about, all the people that was on that boat, it's still a small boat and it's lacking in room. So they used to take the skiffs, and in calm seas, they would tow it behind the ship. And then when a storm's coming, they pull it up into the ship and put it on deck. But if that thing is up on deck all the time, it's in the way. So they don't have the things like they have today where they're secured up off the deck and that, kind of to the side a little bit. So that's what they had to do. So they had to pull this thing up because it was their opportunity. They had already been in a storm. The storm was already going on, and this dinghy's behind them, so they're having to secure it because it's going to get lost. So note there in verse 16 that Luke uses the term "we," indicating that Paul and those in the group helped in bringing the heavy boat up onto the deck. And so Paul and those with him obviously were helping the crew with whatever needed to be done. This was a very dangerous thing that they were involved in, and it was like we say, an all hands on deck situation. So they were helping out. Verses 17 and 19, so they fought the storm by taking drastic measures to save the ship and their lives. So they took precautions by frapping the vessel, which is to pass 4 or 5 turns of a cable-laid rope around the hull to secure the wooden planks from the violent wave motion. So this ship would break apart if they just, they didn't do anything to help it out. So they're working on that. The other thing is that it mentions that about the Syrtis sands there in verse 17. The Syrtis sands are sandbars that constantly change position and were in their path as the ship headed southwest towards Africa. So they needed to change direction, because if they ran into that, this ship is going to be destroyed, and they're going to lose their lives. So to keep that from happening, they lowered the mainsail to allow a westward and slightly northward course. So they're kind of going against the wind, trying to change course a little bit, because if they kept going in the same direction, they're going to end up there. So the violent waves and rain caused the ship to take on water. So they threw things overboard to lighten the ship. I mean, they're trying to keep the thing afloat. So they're trying to get everything out and make it to where it's sitting higher in the water. So non-essential equipment was thrown overboard. There in verse 20, as they continued to be trapped in the storm for many days, each man lost hope of getting out of it alive. You think of being stuck in something, it just goes on and on and on. The longer it goes, the more hope is lost. So that was the feelings of the men. So Paul obviously wouldn't have lost hope because he knew Christ spoke the truth that he would bear witness in Rome. Back in chapter 23, verse 11. And so he knew that. So he didn't have reason to lose hope, but he was certainly concerned about everybody else. So Luke and Aristarchus did not have that same promise and may have been challenged by the possibility of not surviving. So obviously their prayers would be constant in praying for survival if it be God's will. You think of yourself in that same situation, what would you be doing? They would also be praying for each man on the ship. But Paul would have most likely prayed for Luke and Aristarchus as well as every man on board. So we know that God is aware of our needs and is listening to his faithful followers. Matthew chapter 7, verse 7 and 8 says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be open." So God listens, and he knows your situation, but you need to pray. Russell?
Backing up to verse 17, where they use cable to undergird the ship. Wouldn't that be pretty difficult to do that? Put cable one side underneath the ship, right?
Well, you just start at you start at the bow where it's in a point, and so you start at that point and you just start lowering it as you continue to move, along the ship. So yeah, it's a difficult task, but you don't have to leave the ship to do it. So it's just a matter of doing that. So that's the work that needed to be done, and that's something that they had no choice, but they had to do because the ship is made out of wood. And that kind of violence, that ship's not going to survive with the waves, the pounding of the waves, constant. So every time it's rocking and moving back and forth, everything's starting to get looser and looser and looser, and eventually you're going to start losing stuff off that ship, and it's going to come apart. Yeah, to hold it, yeah. So there in verses 21 and 20 through 26, Paul encourages those on the ship. And so he tells them that an angel of God appeared in time of need for Paul. So because of that, he was able to strengthen the others. And so we can compare this to when Christ was being strengthened in the Garden of Gethsemane. You think about that. Christ, he's the Son of God. Does he, did he need that? Yeah, absolutely. He needed the conversation with Moses and Elijah up on the mount when he was transfigured. He needed that. He needed the angels there in the garden for encouragement and strengthening. So an angel appeared to Paul in the same way. I'm referencing Christ there in Luke chapter 22 and verse 43 is where it speaks of an angel appeared to him from heaven and strengthened him. In Acts chapter 27 verse 24, God's grace was extended to each person on that ship for Paul's sake. So this is an excellent demonstration of God's grace. And what is God's grace? Say that again. Unmerited favor. You're not deserving of it, but because of God's love, He takes care of. He takes care of you. He does things for you, and so He was taking care of them. Any other ship would have been involved in this kind of storm, and it probably would have been lost at sea, because without God's grace taking care of them and helping them. But, with prayer, things occur to help you out. So Paul also in verse 26, he also warns them of this coming shipwreck on some island. And he tells them this is what's going to happen, and this is what he was told. So everybody's going to survive, but we're going to go through this shipwreck. So there in verse 27 through 29, the ship was driven up and down the Adriatic Sea, and it's the Mediterranean Sea. Today that Gulf area that's on the west side of Italy, or eastern side of Italy, eastern side. That's called the Adriatic Gulf. So they weren't in that Gulf area because they're trying to make it over to Italy, to Rome, and so they were further south in the Mediterranean Sea, and this storm is driving them up and down. So at one point they're worried about being off the coast of Africa and running into the Sirtis Sands. I mean, this thing is driving them all over the place. So on the 14th night, I guess when you start looking at the time, 14 days in a hurricane, that is a long time, especially in a boat, a ship. So on the 14th night, they were pushed close to an island, and we, of course, know that the island is Malta. King James Version uses the term Melita. So it mentions in verse 28 that they took soundings. And a sounding is a measurement of depth of water. And it's used by a line, and they tie knots. It's a weighted line that they throw in, they put in the water to see, to let it land on the bottom. And it's got marks, knots to mark each fathom, which is 6 feet. So every 6 feet, there's this knot. So they can measure the depth by doing that. So the first time they did it, they found it was at 20 fathoms, which is about 120 feet. And the next time they did it, it's at 15 fathoms. So about 90 feet. So yes, they confirmed what they already sensed. They're getting closer to this island. The only problem is, excuse me, Verse 27 is the 14th night. It's night. You don't want a shipwreck at night. Knowing that they're going to be by this island, you don't want it to occur at night because you need to see. So chances of survival would be much higher when you can see. So to keep that, if they continued, it was going to occur during the night. So to keep that from happening, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern to keep that from happening in verse 29. So there in verses 30 and 32, 30 through 32, sailors tried to escape in the skiff, but Paul warned Julius that unless they stayed in the ship, none would be saved. And so the soldiers cut the ropes and let the skiff fall, and that stopped that from happening. So there would be no further efforts from those sailors getting off that ship because their only way of accomplishing that they got rid of. So getting rid of the skiffs kind of seems counterintuitive. It's like, well, okay, we need a boat to get to the land. Why are we cutting the boat away? So they did that. So it was more important to keep the sailors on that ship because they were going to be needed for what was coming when they start heading into that island. There was a lot of work still that needed to be done, and those sailors were needed to help guide that ship to a specific point as much as possible. So they were needed. So that was done. So in verses 32 through 36, Paul encouraged them to eat food because they needed the strength. Verse 35, Paul took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when I read that, I think, what an example to those non-believers on that ship. There is a God, and we are praying to Him. We're not praying to some false God. So that's what Paul was just a tremendous example to them. And so Paul encouraged all 275 persons on the ship there in verses 36 through 38. So it would be 276 counting Paul. So those on the ship were strengthened mentally by Paul, and they were physically strengthened by the food. So after eating the food, then they threw, what was the ship for? It was a grain ship, Alexandrian grain ship. So remember, they threw everything off the ship much earlier in the storm to lighten it, but they were throwing out everything they didn't need. But they didn't throw the cargo because that cargo is precious, so they didn't throw that out. So here, now they are. There is no way to save that cargo. So they're getting rid of the cargo. So again, that's an all hands on deck kind of thing. For them to do that. So they were throwing out the wheat into the sea. So those on the ship were strengthened mentally by Paul, and they were physically strengthened by the food, which they were going to need that. So after eating the food, they did this. They threw the wheat into the sea. And so they were preparing for the shipwreck. So let's read on to the end of the chapter, verses 39 through 44. Are there any questions? I haven't slowed down for questions. Any questions or anything? Okay. Verse 39, when it was day, They did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach, onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. So there in verse 39, when it was day, the sailors are looking, trying to figure out where are we. We know it's an island, but they're trying to figure out where they're at. And none of them are recognizing it. They were looking for a place to land the ship, so they see a beach where the ship could land, still being driven by the wind toward the island. So in verse 40, they cut the anchors loose and hoisted the mainsail to use the rudders to steer the ship toward the beach. So they're aiming it. And verse 41, it says they struck a place where the two seas met. So it's a sandbar. They didn't make it to the beach. They ran into a sandbar. So the problem with that is land is out a little bit. It's close enough to swim to and everything, but it's not like the front of the ship is hanging over onto the sand where you can just get off on the island. So there's water. They've got to swim. That's the only way. And so they're figuring out what they got to do. And so with the front of the ship stuck on the sandbar, the pounding waves began destroying the back of the ship. So now the waves have got, it's holding it hard, fast. And so now the waves, instead of pushing the ship along, now it's pounding against it. So now the ship is coming apart. So the soldiers see what's going on, so they're concerned about their lives. And if we lose a prisoner, we know what's going to happen. So how are we going to save ourselves and worry about trying to keep prisoners from escaping? So their plan was we'll just kill them all. And so that was their plan. But Julius, wanting to save Paul, he kept that from happening. So Julius's favor toward Paul apparently grew more and more as his trust did in what Paul said, and he just grew to trust Paul. So he believed what Paul was saying. Nobody's gonna die. We're all gonna be saved. So he's trusting Paul. So he's trying to keep he's ordered that the soldiers not do that. So Julius, he commanded everyone to jump into the water from the ship and either swim or float to shore. So this all occurred while the storm's continuing. So each person had to struggle with the large waves to get to shore. You think ever swam at the beach, the violence of the waves. You're trying to swim or something, here comes a wave, and it kind of knocks you off course a little bit. So you got to look and see where you're at and keep swimming. So all that's going on. So, so the ones that couldn't swim, they are grabbing a hold of something in the water, boards, pieces of the ship. If I don't know how to swim, I think I ought to look for a bigger, a door, something bigger. So anyway, that's what they all had to do. So we'll go ahead and end there and continue on with chapter 28 next Sunday, Lord willing. So any questions about all of this? Kind of covered a lot of what's going on. And so why is this in the Bible? What do we learn from it?
Paul's strength and conviction to spreading the word.
Yeah, but we learn they're in a very dangerous situation. What should we do in those situations? Pray, trust God. The more you've been you've say that again, Gene. I couldn't hear. Right, but it is hard. It is hard, and we say it like it's easy to do, but it is hard. When something looks really bad, I was in a bad wreck one time, and when I'm looking, I'm thinking, I don't think I'm going to survive this. So I was just praying and got hit, and I survived. But but there's times when it looks pretty bad. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I thank everybody for your attention, and we will begin with chapter 28 next Sunday.